Welcome to the no man's memory, where wars become stories. Just before dawn, inside one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth, radar operators aboard an American warship noticed something unusual. Several contacts that had been moving on stable courses suddenly changed direction. Not gradually, not ambiguously, but directly toward the U.S. naval formation moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Within seconds, the atmosphere aboard the ships changed. Battle stations were manned, fire control systems activated. Radar operators began tracking speed, bearing, and projected intercept points. In confined waters like Hormuz, there's very little room for improvisation. The vessels approaching were Chinese warships. At least one destroyer accompanied by support ships had already been operating in the broader Gulf region for days. Their presence alone was unusual. Their sudden maneuver toward an American formation was something else entirely. Radio traffic erupted almost immediately. American commanders demanded clarification. The response that came back was cold, precise, and deeply provocative. Chinese officers informed the U.S. Navy that they were conducting their own freedom of navigation exercise, using almost exactly the same language Washington has used for decades in contested waters around the world. For the next 30 minutes, two nuclear powers held their course. Every sensor aboard the American ships remained fixed on the approaching formation. Every sailor understood the mathematics of what was happening. One navigational error, one equipment malfunction, one nervous decision from a weapons officer under pressure. In a corridor this narrow, history could pivot in seconds. What happened in those 30 minutes was not simply a naval encounter. It was a warning about the kind of world now taking shape. One where the competition between Washington and Beijing no longer stops in the Pacific. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping route. It is one of the most strategically important waterways on the planet. A narrow maritime artery linking the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, carrying a massive share of the world's energy supply every single day. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles across. But the actual shipping lanes used by the world's largest oil tankers are far tighter than that, compressed into carefully managed corridors where massive vessels move slowly and predictably through confined water. That geography makes everything more dangerous. In the open ocean, naval formations have room to maneuver, reposition, or de-escalate. Inside Hormuz, those options shrink dramatically. Ships are funneled through limited space. Coastlines sit within striking distance, and every vessel operates under the shadow of nearby military infrastructure. And those coastlines are not neutral. Iran's southern shoreline overlooks much of the strait with missile batteries, drone launch points, naval staging areas, and years of military preparation tied directly to the assumption that Hormuz could one day become a battlefield. That means a confrontation in Hormuz is never just between ships at sea. Geography pulls in land-based weapons, regional militaries, commercial shipping, oil markets, and global diplomacy almost instantly. A tactical incident can become an international crisis far faster here than almost anywhere else, which is why the idea of Chinese warships deliberately testing an American naval formation in this corridor mattered so much. Chinese warships do not casually appear in the Persian Gulf. Moving naval assets this far from home requires logistics, fuel support, diplomatic coordination, and strategic intent. Whatever explanation Beijing offered publicly, this was not an accidental presence. Officially, Chinese authorities framed their naval deployment as part of anti-piracy cooperation and broader regional engagement. Anti-piracy patrols have given major navies a legitimate reason to operate far from home waters before, but intelligence communities tend to look past the press release and ask a simpler question: why here and why now? Because the Persian Gulf matters deeply to China. Beijing imports enormous volumes of energy from the Middle East. Oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz helps sustain Chinese industry, transportation, manufacturing, and economic growth. From Beijing's perspective, depending indefinitely on American naval dominance to keep that route open creates a long-term strategic vulnerability. That concern has shaped Chinese military thinking for years. Over the last decade, China transformed its navy from a largely regional force into something capable of sustained operations much farther from East Asia. Aircraft carriers entered service. Modern destroyers expanded in number. Logistics networks slowly extended outward. The deeper strategic message was clear. China no longer intended to remain confined to its own neighborhood. The South China Sea may have been the obvious arena, but Beijing's ambitions were never limited to the Pacific, which makes the timing of this Hormuz encounter harder to dismiss. This was not simply a naval movement. It looked much more like strategic signaling, a deliberate reminder that China's interests now reach into waters the United States once treated as uncontested territory. The most dangerous moments in military history are often the quiet ones, when everyone understands exactly what could happen, but no one yet knows what will. For the crews inside the Strait of Hormuz that morning, those moments stretched into 30 tense minutes. Once the Chinese ships altered course, the geometry of the encounter became unmistakable. Both formations were now moving along paths that could bring them into dangerously close proximity inside a confined waterway already crowded by commercial traffic and shaped by surrounding military tension. American commanders immediately demanded clarification over open radio channels. The reply from the Chinese side was calm, measured, and deliberately provocative. Their officers stated they were conducting a freedom of navigation exercise using language almost identical to what the United States has used for years when challenging maritime claims in places like the South China Sea. That phrasing mattered. This was not merely a navigational explanation. It was a political message wrapped inside naval procedure. Beijing was effectively telling Washington that the same logic America applies near China's coastline could now be applied near waters critical to American influence. During those 30 minutes, both sides maintained course and readiness. Fire control systems remained active. Sensors tracked every movement. Sailors on both sides understood that even if neither government wanted war, tactical accidents do not ask permission. A faulty radar return, a misunderstood maneuver, a weapons officer interpreting movement as hostile. In an environment this compressed, escalation can begin before senior leaders even understand what has happened. And yet neither side fired. That restraint would matter, because what happened next shifted the confrontation from tactical danger into strategic response. What surprised many observers was not that the United States reacted. It was how quickly the response appeared to take shape. The confrontation in the Strait had barely begun before Washington's wider strategic machinery was already moving. Regional partners were contacted almost immediately. Intelligence channels that normally operate quietly in the background became active, sharing real-time assessments across allied networks. Military planners began evaluating force posture throughout the broader Gulf region, treating the encounter not as an isolated naval annoyance, but as a deliberate geopolitical signal. That speed suggested something important. This scenario had likely already been wargamed. Great powers do not improvise every response from scratch, especially in choke points as strategically sensitive as Hormuz. The speed of coordination implied pre-existing contingency planning for confrontations involving outside powers operating in the Gulf. Diplomatic communication moved in parallel. Gulf governments that depend heavily on U.S. security guarantees would have needed reassurance quickly. Any perception of hesitation from Washington could create uncertainty among regional allies already balancing security ties with America against growing economic relationships with China. Public messaging mattered too. Rapid acknowledgement of an incident can shape the narrative before competing versions emerge. In gray zone confrontations, perception often becomes part of the battlefield itself. China had tested presence and proximity. Washington answered with coordination and visible readiness, signaling that even if the confrontation ended without shots fired, it had not gone unnoticed. To understand the confrontation, you have to understand what Beijing may have been trying to communicate. Naval incidents like this are rarely just about the ships involved. They are messages, carefully constructed signals aimed at multiple audiences at once. The first audience was Washington. For decades, the United States has operated in the Persian Gulf as the dominant external military power, shaping maritime security, protecting shipping lanes, and projecting force with relatively little serious challenge from other great powers. From Beijing's perspective, that monopoly creates strategic dependence. China's economy relies heavily on imported energy, and much of that energy passes through Hormuz. That means Beijing's long-term economic security is tied, at least indirectly, to a maritime corridor historically protected by the United States Navy. For a rising power increasingly focused on strategic autonomy, that dependency is uncomfortable. The second audience was domestic. Military signaling can serve internal political purposes as much as external ones, demonstrating that Chinese warships can operate confidently in distant strategic waters reinforces narratives of national strength, modernization, and global reach. And then there was the broader international audience, especially Gulf states. Beijing has spent years expanding economic influence across the Middle East through trade, infrastructure, energy partnerships, and diplomatic engagement. A visible naval presence sends a quiet message. China is not just an economic actor here anymore. Seen through that lens, the confrontation looks less like an isolated maneuver and more like a strategic statement. Beijing may not have been seeking war, but it may very well have been testing how far its growing presence could reach before Washington pushed back. For the governments watching from the Gulf, the confrontation raised a deeply uncomfortable question. If competition between Washington and Beijing moves into their neighborhood, where exactly are they supposed to stand? For decades, much of the region's security architecture has been built around the United States. American naval patrols, air defense systems, intelligence sharing, military bases, and arms partnerships have formed the backbone of Gulf security planning. When threats emerged, Washington was traditionally the outside power expected to respond. But economics have changed the equation. China has become a major trading partner for multiple Gulf states, a critical customer for energy exports, and an increasingly important investor in infrastructure and technology. For some governments, economic ties with Beijing are no longer secondary. They are central to long-term development planning. That creates strategic tension. Security still leans toward Washington. Economics increasingly lean toward Beijing. In a world where those two relationships remain separate, the balancing act is manageable. But once military confrontation enters the picture, neutrality becomes much harder. A direct U.S.-China crisis in the Gulf could force difficult choices about base access, intelligence cooperation, diplomatic alignment, and public positioning. Supporting Washington too openly could strain economic ties with China. Remaining ambiguous could create doubts about reliability within existing security partnerships. And uncertainty itself becomes leverage. If Beijing can make Gulf governments question whether American dominance is permanent or whether strategic diversification is necessary, then even limited military signaling can produce political effects far beyond the immediate naval encounter. What happened in Hormuz makes more sense when placed inside a much larger pattern. Great power competition is not always fought through open war. Much of it unfolds in the gray zone, the uncomfortable space between peace and direct conflict, where pressure is applied carefully enough to avoid triggering full escalation. China has become increasingly skilled in this kind of competition. In the South China Sea, artificial islands appeared where none existed before, then gradually transformed into militarized outposts. Near Taiwan, air and naval patrols have grown larger, more frequent, and more provocative without crossing into outright war. In the East China Sea, persistent pressure has become part of the strategic landscape. The logic behind these moves is methodical. Probe the boundaries, test responses, identify political hesitation, learn where the opposing side's red lines actually are, not in speeches but in behavior, then adjust accordingly. That is what makes gray zone competition so difficult to manage. Respond too aggressively, and you risk escalating a limited confrontation into something much larger. Respond too weakly, and you signal that the tactic is working. Seen through that framework, the Hormuz confrontation looks less like a spontaneous naval incident and more like another data point in a broader strategic campaign. A test of American reactions in a region far from East Asia, but deeply important to global stability. And for Washington, that creates a persistent dilemma. The challenge is not simply defeating an adversary in war. It is responding strongly enough to deter future probes without accidentally turning a strategic test into a real shooting conflict. The real danger in confrontations like this is not always deliberate aggression. Sometimes it is simple human error unfolding inside an unforgiving environment. The Strait of Hormuz offers very little margin for mistakes. Warships operating in confined waters rely on constant sensor interpretation, rapid communication, and disciplined decision-making under pressure. The technology is not perfect. Radar returns can be misread. Maneuvers can be interpreted incorrectly. Radio communication can be misunderstood, especially between forces already expecting tension. And once weapon systems are active, time compresses dramatically. A contact moving unexpectedly may force decisions in seconds, not minutes. Officers are trained for that reality, but training does not eliminate uncertainty. It only helps manage it. The stakes become even more severe when both sides are nuclear powers. No one expects a local naval encounter to escalate directly into strategic war until history reminds everyone how quickly crises can spiral when national prestige, military readiness, and imperfect information collide. Hormuz makes this worse because geography limits de-escalation options. In open ocean, ships can widen separation, alter course safely, or create physical distance. Inside a narrow strategic corridor surrounded by regional military tension, those options shrink. That is why the 30-minute standoff mattered. Not because shots were fired, but because none were, despite all the ingredients that could have made the opposite outcome frighteningly plausible. What happened in the Strait of Hormuz may ultimately be remembered not as an isolated confrontation, but as a warning about where great power competition is heading next. For years, most discussions about U.S.-China rivalry focused on the Pacific, Taiwan, the South China Sea, East Asian shipping lanes, semiconductor supply chains, and military modernization. But great powers rarely keep competition neatly contained to one region when their interests are global. China's economic dependence on Gulf energy ensures that the Middle East matters strategically to Beijing. America's long-standing military architecture in the region ensures it matters just as deeply to Washington. Those realities create overlap, and overlap creates friction. The confrontation in Hormuz suggested that this friction may no longer remain theoretical. A narrow waterway historically associated with regional crises could increasingly become another arena where global power competition plays out indirectly through signaling, pressure, and carefully calibrated tests of resolve. And that may be the most unsettling part of the story. Not that two rival powers came dangerously close in a strategic choke point, but that future encounters may become more common, not less, because neither side is likely to disappear. China's interests in the region will continue growing. The United States is unlikely to abandon decades of strategic investment overnight. And where enduring interests collide, contact becomes inevitable. The 30-minute standoff ended without catastrophe. But history has a habit of treating early warnings as background noise until the day one of them goes differently.